I am so excited to present our new DIR Parent Network. We at ICDL have worked hard to listen to your wishes and have put together an incredible program of support and resources for caregivers. Let's continue our amazing community supporting each other and build upon it. Let's support, learn, and thrive together. More information at icdl.com/parents or affectautism.com/events. You're listening to Affect Autism, where affect is the #1 tool we use in supporting child development through playful interactions. Welcome, listeners. I am Daria Brown. This is the We Chose Play podcast from Affect Autism, and I am thrilled today to finally really dive into the 4th functional emotional developmental capacity with Katie Shepard and Sanette Lorenz. And we are going to cover information that they brought up in their presentation at the ICDL conference in New York City in March. And their presentation was called The Spectrum of FEDC4, again, functional emotional developmental capacity in the DIR model, developmental individual differences relationship-based model. Welcome, ladies.
Thanks for having us.
It's amazing to be here, Daria.
So Katie Shepard is a DIR expert training leader with ICDL, the International Council on Development and Learning, and a speech-language pathologist in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Sanette Lorenz is the owner of Sensorium Therapy, Inc., a DIR occupational therapy practice in Redding, California. Sanette completed the Napa UC Davis Infant Parent Mental Health Fellowship in 2022. Reflective practice development in DIR is one of her passions. So I am thrilled to have you guys on. Why did you choose this topic to present about at the ICDL conference? Let's start with you, Sanette.
Katie and I co-led a DIR 201, and we just had such a lovely synchrony and reciprocity. And so we came together and we're like, how can we bring this to the conference? And the one area we really wanted to go deeper in was FEDC4, because it's complex. It is called complex communication and complex problem solving, but it is a more complex and an incredibly foundational shift in the child's affect development and development of self. It's incredibly foundational shift. So we named our presentation The Spectrum of FEDC4, because you almost have that imagery of a white light going into a prism and then radiating the colors of the rainbow. And that is how FEDC4 is. It is when everything is stepping up. The regulation is stepping up. The communication is complexity. Even the child sourcing of their system, and we're going to dive more into that. But there's so many things that's stepping up, and there's more nuances. And so I think we were trying to capture this complexity and nuances in the word spectrum of FEDC4. And we wanted to, we appreciate that you're interviewing us on this topic, because we want this to be a resource for people to come and learn more or dig in deeper and have more thoughts and wonderings about FEDC4. Because it is in our training, we have DIR 201, which we dive deeper into FEDC 1 through 4. And then in DIR 202, we learn about FEDC 4 through 6. So 4 is always visited. And so it is, and again, even today, it is quite complex and beautiful. And I just want to say, as Katie and I did our research into 4, and we really looked at all the resources, what the doctors Greenspan and Witter and so on say, we really dive deeper in. We were just both, each time we met, we both expressed a sense of awe and humility in the breadth and the depth and the width of this model. And just how beautiful it is in meeting every child and every family.
Yes, that was a wonderful description, and I've never thought about that before, but that image of the light going through the prism, I remember when I was a child, I did my science fair project in elementary school on rainbows and spectrums, and I was obsessed with prisms and, those crystals that you hang in the window and you see the rainbows, and so I love that imagery. And as I watch FEDC4 unfold in my own son, who's now 15, he's sort of he started peeking into FEDC4 at least 7 years ago. And he's still getting in there and, working on mastering a lot of those things that are in FEDC4 and still struggling with some of the aspects of it. So when I think about that rainbow, like that is such a beautiful image. So thank you for that, Sinette. And I will refer people to the podcast with Naomi and Andrea just 2 weeks ago, focusing more on the third functional emotional developmental capacity, intentionality and two-way communication. You really should watch and listen to that before you listen to this one, because now we're diving into the next capacity, the fourth functional emotional developmental capacity. Like I said with them, it could be, divided into a million subcapacities in itself. So let's define what it is.
Okay. Quickly, I'd just like to say that at the conference, I went to Naomi and Andrea's presentation right before ours, and I thought that was such a great jumpstart, because you really can't think of a capacity without thinking of the other capacity. So I don't think Dr. Greenspan intended any of us to just work on one capacity at a time. So I think that would be a beautiful thing to go and review that podcast as well, because when you think about capacity 3 and all of the back and forth interactions, then when we get to capacity 4, those interactions become longer and more continuous and more complex. I would say that it involves long chains of affectively charged and continuous circles of communication. And I think I want to emphasize that affectively charged and continuous flow, because that's so important. We just want that flow of circles of communication. And in capacity 4, they become more complex as the interaction progresses. And these are meaningful interactions that we're talking about. And so FEDC4 also involves the use of many communicative signals. As a speech language pathologist, I love to talk about communication and the communicative signals that are involved. So we're thinking about facial expressions. We're thinking about gestures. We're thinking about all forms of body language, vocalizations, or not always. I want to emphasize or, because I think that's a very important point. Words, those beautiful words, to communicate increasingly more complex ideas. So I just want to go back to the or, because as a DIR 201 instructor, I value and celebrate and appreciate that pre-verbal experience so much. And I love sharing this with Sinette when we were in our 201, but that non-speaking communication is so important to promote and to encourage. And in capacity 4, it becomes more complex, that complex gestural communication. Individuals express more complex ideas gesturally and with their facial expressions and with their vocalizations and the sound effects, and so I want to just emphasize that. And then also, when we're thinking about those communicative signals that become more complex, we also want to highlight how this is interactive. So in capacity 4, we're thinking about interactively solving problems with another person. There's a sense of there's a togetherness about this shared social problem solving. And we just want to think about the development of these interactions, really. Another important component of capacity 4 to mention, if I were giving a definition, I would say we need to maintain regulation while experiencing a broader range of emotions for longer periods of time. And then we establish through all of these beautiful, rich, meaningful back and forth interactions, we establish this sense of self and this understanding of a you and a me. When we develop this sense of self, we're able to advocate for ourselves, and that ability to say no and to make decisions. And so we want to be able to support their pursuit to lead. So that's another part of capacity 4. Lead reciprocal interactions, and then also sequence sequence ideas and execute action plans. So, and that's where that recognition of patterns comes in. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. But we just want to make sure that all of this is interactive. That's interactive problem solving with a communication partner, even under healthy levels of stress.
I love the thoroughness. And I want to point out a couple of things because I facilitate ICDL's parent support meeting weekly and an evening one monthly. And I hear questions all the time. I hear what parents are thinking. They're trying to figure out the model. They're learning about the FEDCs. And there can be a lot of misunderstandings at the beginning. It took me probably 4 or 5 years before I even remembered what the first 6 FEDCs were, even though I read them 8 billion times. Just to really understand them takes a long time. And as you mentioned, we're always working on all of the FEDCs at once. It's not like they're regulated at the first capacity, and now we're going to look for engagement, and then we're going to do back and forth, and then we're going to problem solve. No, it's trying to get at all of that at the same time while having all of these other things in mind. And we've talked about how it's like a spiral where we're going back and forth in other podcasts. You're moving, you might, if you get dysregulated, then you're working to get that regulation and engagement and communication and everything back and all of this. But I think what you highlighted, which really resonated with me, was that it is continuous. It's that interactive, continuous flow as opposed to stop-start communication. So a lot of times, parents will say, oh, well, my child does back and forth communication, but it might just be circle, stop, a circle, stop, a circle, stop. So it might be ask a question, they answer. Ask another question, they answer. They'll say something, you answer, and then you change the topic. And this is really about that continuous flow. So we're going back and forth. We're really communicating with each other. But the idea is we want to strengthen that capacity where you're able to maintain that continuous flow. And the other thing that I liked what you said was about staying regulated through a range of emotions, and it doesn't just have to be happy. So in my series, We Chose Play, I have a video of my son and dad playing, and my son was quite young, but he started to demonstrate this, and I didn't notice these things at the time. I noticed them years later, looking back at the videos, like, wow, he had a lot of capacities, more than I realized, even though there were lots of constrictions in the capacities. Dad was trying to push forward an idea, a more symbolic idea, that the train is going to go by and put out the fire. And my son was like, no, Dada, no, Dada, no, Dada. And, really protesting. And his dad was like, well, who's going to put out the fire then? And he just stuck with this more symbolic idea. And my son was like, no, Dada, no, Dada, no. And then slowly, no, Dada, no, no, Dada, no, no, Dada. And then eventually had a train come by. So even though he was getting dysregulated and upset, he was able to stay engaged and continue that back and forth interaction. And so that may be more of a third capacity thing than the fourth. But I mean, he was before that, he would have just got up and walked away. But he was able to stay in the interaction because he was so motivated by playing with his trains and really wanted to be a part of that and liked to be playing with dad. So I wanted to bring up that point. And then 2 other points, which we'll get into, but you brought up praxis, like motor planning, and although you didn't use either of those words, but we'll talk about that going forward too, like being able to understand patterns and what comes next. And I know, my son is dyspraxic, so he has challenges around that. And the final thing I wanted to bring up was you mentioned about regulation. Like I just remember what really stuck out for me learning the model was how Greenspan really focused on the turning point of development is when you can co-regulate with another person. Just looking at mom and seeing her face and that can calm me down, and being able to co-regulate with a partner, as opposed to, he called it, catastrophic emotional reactions. And my son hasn't had a lot of catastrophic emotional reactions in years and years. Getting to the point where your child feels safe enough that they don't have those catastrophic reactions and they can really co-regulate with you is really a part of FEDC4 too.
About when he was interacting with his dad with the train and going, no, daddy, no, daddy. But he really wanted to stay there with him because of the relationship. I'm wondering about the affective signaling that dad was using, and if it was going from pretty intense to then less intense, and he was still able to stay there. I'm wondering if there was some nice back and forth flow with the communicative signals that they were exchanging with one another, or gestures or body language that dad was using to help maintain a connection. What do you think, Daria? Do you know? Do you remember?
Well, dad's affect was pretty neutral in that video.
Okay.
He was
Okay.
just starting to learn floor time and was more sticking with his agenda than understanding that whole piece. So it was pretty calm. That's the one thing that was different between the two of us, especially when he was little, is dad just always was chill and calm, whereas mom would get so upset if he got upset, like, oh, my poor baby, I want to do everything to make you feel better. And dad was able to just stay calm throughout the whole thing. But that's an important point, is that depending on how the parents react and the affect that's used, and everybody has to find their own genuine affect. And I think, especially in the beginning, I would try and get dad to do floor time in a certain way, and my style's so different, and for him to find where he's comfortable. And I would see that depending on the activities that we did. Like, I would be less comfortable doing certain things that he would be great at doing. And so that's where we tried to focus it. Like, okay, you do these activities because you're more comfortable and your affect is more genuine in those situations. I tend to be more like the teacher type, and that stereotypical kindergarten teacher who's like this with the children, and that's very natural to me when I'm around kids. And he just couldn't do that. And the problem now is that I'm still doing that with my 15-year-old, and I've got to start being more like, mom to a teenager as opposed to toddler, because he seemed like a toddler to me for so many years. But that's another topic. Yeah, that affect is a key part.
And just that you said over time that he hasn't had a catastrophic reaction like that in so long.
Very
And
rare.
it's because of the interaction. You do floor time all the time, and it's all about the interaction. And through those rich emotional interactions, and you stretching the interactions with your affective signaling and all the ways that you tailor your interactions, he has learned so much about how to tame his own emotions. And so I think I just wanted to mention that as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many places to go, but just going to that train example, what you were pointing out that will fit into this idea of 4 was the regulation, that the dad sticking to the fire. And it could have been that the dad was flooding the child. It could have been that that emotional problem was a little too much. And maybe the dad, whatever the signaling was to support that, we don't know. But the point is, what you highlighted is that the child could stay. And so that is what you're starting to see when you go into 4, is that capacity. The regulation has a bigger bandwidth. There's more stability in the regulation. While you work a lot harder in FEDC 1, 2, and 3 to maintain and support the regulation. And the other big thing to point out is in that little story that you shared, this idea of affect-mediated problem solving comes to the front, is that there was a problem created that had meaning to the child. It was affect mediated. And I think when we talk about what is FEDC4, we should also talk about what is it not. And so it's not just having a problem in the play. So having a DIR session and say, oh, there were problems, I worked on FEDC4, that's not FEDC4. The problem must have so much meaning to the child. It must be, think about this word, affect-mediated problem solving. It must have meaning to the child. And it is in that meaning that the child will negotiate and navigate. And you hear that in the story you shared, there was a little bit of negotiation of his own internal system and his father's system. There was a negotiation and a navigation. And so it's interesting to also reflect on, when we think of FEDC3, the circles of communication, the words that we often use to pin that is that the child realizes they have impact and influence, right? And that's that FEDC3, that circles the initiation, and you gesture and respond, and the child does, and you have the circles, right? And then that goes into the flow of 4. But in 4, the child realizes the world is their oyster. And this concept of the signaling goes into this element of negotiation and navigating. And I can resource the other in the problem, and the problem is meaningful to me. And I do want to do a quick little rabbit hole onto playful obstruction, and which is one of our lovely flow time techniques, right? Playful obstruction. So when you have the flow and it's cooking, and you can see the play is cooking, and we're signaling, and there's a, you can just, there's just this element of the world is the oyster. You don't have to do too much to regulate. You can bring a problem in and you do a playful obstruction. So you, as the adult player or the floor timer, created a problem. Now, the thing we need to remember is we want it to be, if that problem is going to go into the FEDC4 realm, we want it to be affect mediated. It needs to be meaningful to the child, and the childs need to resource you to solve the problem through their communication system. And so a lot of times we do playful obstruction, and the child will use what we call magical problem solving. Look, the fire is out, I'm thinking of playing Matchbox cars, and the car goes, and let's say my playful obstruction is, my car stopped. And, maybe the child is, I'm looking, what is the child going to do with this? What kind of problem is the child going to create? And maybe the child said, I think it's out of gas, and they lean over, it's full, I fueled it, and then off you go. So that's, magical problem solving, instead of seeing the sequence of, oh, golly, I think we need to call AAA, or we need to open the hood, let's see what's going on, or shall we call a mechanic, or shall we tow truck the car to the nearest gas station, because we did erect a little town with a garage. So you would like to see ideally the sequencing and the resourcing of the sequencing, but often the children will do the magical problem solving. So to go back to the affect mediation, it's just that when we do playful obstruction, to finish my rabbit hole, make sure that the problem has meaning to the child. And if it doesn't, let it go and continue working on the flow.
And yes, so going back to that third capacity and get that back and forth flow strengthened, and then back up into the next capacity. So something that you said really piques my interest, Sanette, because I'm thinking, if I'm playing with my son's Super Mario Hot Wheels cars and I say, oh no, my car stopped, he would just grab it and move it. He's not bringing in those symbolic elements yet, like, oh, let's put more gas in. Oh, we have to go to the gas station. He's not doing that yet. Or if he is, it's because he saw it on a TV show and he's just imitating the script that he saw. So this is where the element of thinking really comes in, because DIR is really promoting thinking. And I remember Dr. Gil Tippy saying to me early on, lots of interventions can master the first 3 capacities, but it's floor time that brings us into the higher capacities where you're thinking. And of course, the praxis piece comes in there, because if you don't know what idea to do next, it's hard to come up with those problem-solving ideas.
I think it's also really important to remember that social problem solving is so much more than verbal negotiation as well. And so using our bodies and really getting in there together, and I can think of all the affective ways that what you could do with your body language with your car or his car, and like, oh, Like you're looking at each other together, you're interactively going to affectively figure out this problem together. Like, oh, I mean, the whole pattern, the action pattern of your movements are going to make sense to him. And so I think that being able for him to understand the action patterns of your movement, your vocal action patterns, and the social action patterns that you're going to exchange with one another. And I think that's going to bring meaning to the solution, whatever that is.
Just like in FEDC 3, we initiate more, and then eventually the child starts to initiate. In FEDC 4, maybe I'm, offering like, I wonder what we should do. Maybe we could go to a gas station, or, but, he'll just then bring that up every time. Go to the gas station, and won't think up a new idea.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and that is one of the challenges, is to ignite so you use the word thinking, and I want to say bring thinking down to the child's ideation. Like, we want to support the child's ideas, So one of the big elements, or architectural elements, if we want to call that, of FEDC4 is gestural communication or nonverbal communication. And that system is so foundational across lifespan when we do DIR floor time. And so think about, what do we mean by that nonverbal communication system, that gestural communication system? And just for the sake of anybody who's listening for the first time, that is, when you are using your whole communication system. It is the glance of your eye, the way you tilt your head. It is the way you lean in or lean out, is your posture. It's not just hand gestures. Gesturing doesn't just mean hand gestures. It's really I see your nonverbal gestural system as actually a mind-body system that is foundational on your interoceptive ability. So it's your interoceptive system, that's sensations from the inside of your body that comes together in that moment with the sensations from the outside. And it's that mind-body connection. And it allows you to feel the emotion and embody the emotion, with the glance. So I'm thinking about my granddaughter. I have this I'm a grandmother now, and my first grandchild, her name is Lila. And when she was 6 months, her gesture was an eyebrow, just the eyebrow. The eyebrow. I could see the world in that eyebrow, and so much communication just in the eyebrow. And it was so beautiful to watch the gestural system unfold. Then it was the glance, then it was the head tilt, and now that she's she's 11 months now, it's very complex. Her whole reservoir of nonverbal communication has expanded. She's got the vocalizations and a lot of the pointing, and it is just rich and beautiful, and she's able to bring a lot more of herself into the play. And so, when you are in that situation where your child is stuck, well, how can you embody emotion through your nonverbal system? And of course, that includes vocalization. Really? So let's say the child you refueled the car, and the car's now going, maybe my car it stopped. Oh, can you see how that's inviting? Instead of saying, what do I do now? Just like, and so one thing I want to say about the gestural system, when you use nonverbal gestures and that system, you are giving the child feedback. Right? And the child has to use the eyes and ears to take your gestural system in. And so it actually, it works in a multi-system way, but it is actually a continuous feedback loop that modulates and regulates the child. And in that modulation and regulation of the gestures, it provides the regulation also for ideation.
I love the way you described that. I loved it. And I'm going to put links in the blog post for this. If you're watching on YouTube, the link is below the YouTube video, to the I think it's called Pre-Verbal Affective Signaling podcast I did with Jean Christian, which was so enlightening to me at the time. I have another one with another speech pathologist from Floor Time Atlanta about pre-verbal signaling. I have my motor planning building blocks with Maud LaRue, who was a mentor to Sanette, and you guys might recognize the similarities. They both have the South African accent. And I have, lots of different references, but the way that you just put it together, I loved it, Sanette, because I've never heard it described as combining the interoception, that sense of what's going on in your body, with the outside. And it's so true. Like you said, if I made the car go like it's running out of gas, but I didn't say that. I didn't say, oh, verbally, what can we do? And we'll talk about this going forward too. Like, what about our children who are non-speaking, who are older? They don't need the verbal communication to get into FEDC4. We can communicate, and so much of the communication isn't verbal. And how do we use more of that? I know that Maud LaRue shared with me, occupational therapist who has a clinic in just outside of Philadelphia, shared that she will get parents to just sit for, I can't remember how many minutes she said, and not use language at all, just to get them to practice that nonverbal communication. Yeah, I love it.
I'm thinking of a specific example that I showed in the presentation of a little girl that I work with, and she loves to play firefighters, and so we were putting out fires together, and then one of the fires, we were too late, and so it was already, the house was black with soot, and we were trying to get all of the soot off. And so we were doing this together, and she really was doing a lot of intentional imitation, because what I was doing with my sponge, I accidentally put a hole in there, and she was like, oh, and so then she'd magically fix it. And then I did another one, and then she'd fix it again. But then she started putting holes in the wall accidentally. And then we were just having a great back and forth. It was a lot of capacity 3, just going back and forth. But then I was standing, and she said, okay, come over here. And I was like, oh, I'm afraid that I was like, oh, is the floor stable? And so I was worried that the floor was gonna fall. And she said, oh, it's fine. And then with my affect, I was like, oh, I was showing in my face that I was afraid, but not saying anything. And then she was like, come on. And then she tried with her toe. So she lifted up her little foot and put her toe. And that was her idea. But she didn't say anything. She just lifted up her toe. And I was like, oh, yeah. So together, we both put our toes onto the floor, and we pushed just a little bit, and then we were able to stand on it. And but it was all together, and this was a stretched out, non-speaking interaction. We were looking at each other, so there was social referencing, there was affective signal exchange with our facial expressions, and we were also sharing the emotion of being nervous, and then we did it together. We tried it together, and then there was this relief. And then the interaction continued, and I pretended to fall through the floor, and all of these other things happened. But that moment of that shared, it was shared social problem solving. Together, we were going to figure out if this floor was going to fall through, but we were doing it with our body language, and we were sharing that together. And so I felt like that was a good example of FEDC4.
It's just figuring out what to do next can be the problem. And you were figuring out, can I go here? Like, it doesn't have to be some grand, elaborate problem that we need to solve. And also, not having to, one mistake that I made early on was trying to create a problem every 2 seconds. Like, it's too much. We go, oh, in my head, okay, I have to expand and challenge. And so just trying to make it harder and harder, instead of focusing on staying in the moment, being in the moment, and using that affect gestural system and everything that Sanette so eloquently described and you just eloquently described.
And supporting their pursuit to lead. They're going to tell you, they're going to let you know what happens next. So we want to follow their lead. We truly want to follow their lead, and the ideas will come from them.
And that's the hardest part too, is parents waiting. Because you can tell, I tell parents, slow down again. And then when you think you couldn't go any slower, slow down 10 times more than that. Because you watch videos of yourself and you're like, whoa, like I didn't wait at all to see what the child's idea was. I jumped in with my idea. And that's another, I think, thing that is challenging. So I'm glad you brought that up, Katie.
Yeah, I just want to say that, as Katie was describing that, from a player's perspective, right? Katie, you were in that video, you were playing, you were describing the interaction and your experience, and you're still glowing. When you recall that, we can see in your affect that stayed with you, right? And that is, and when you think about just to bring in reflection, because we always use reflection as a source of information, right? Because it's a relationship-based approach. And if you think about the quality of engagement in FEDC2, when we have a shared world, it's that warmth and pleasure and joy and that feeling in love quality. You can see that in the videos. When you watch the DIR full-time videos, you can see that quality of falling in love. But now, just as you described, there's a quality of the collaboration that you created. The I and the me became a we and a us, and you created this togetherness. It's almost like a wave that's building and breaking as the problem's getting solved. That collaboration, the quality of collaboration, the quality of engagement has this collaboration. It's like we are doing this together, and you can sense it. You can sense it in yourself as the player, and you can sense it as you watch it, and it's just beautiful. It's just beautiful.
That's so important what she just said, because it goes to the R, right? The relationship too. I mean, and this little girl, she's I just adore her, and I truly have a wonderful relationship with her and her family, and there's a trust. So there's the trust, there is the co-regulation because of the relationship, and because of the pacing of the interaction, like you mentioned, Daria, we were slowing it down. And then there was so much engagement because we were just there together in the moment. And of course, we're having some back and forth interactions, and they're becoming more complex as we solve the problem. But it had so much to do with the relationship. So I appreciate you mentioning that, Sanette.
And while you're on the topic of R, let's highlight, we brought up some mention of individual differences, but always paying attention to the child's individual profile. I mentioned that my son has dyspraxia, and so he will have, challenges sequencing ideas. And one thing that was very interesting, I'd love to get your take on it, Katie, as a speech language pathologist. His speech language pathologist is Sabrina O'Keefe, who I did a podcast with recently on Gestalt language processing. Since we recorded that podcast and she's had a few more sessions with my son, she pointed out something that she's thinking. It's her working theory right now that seems to be accurate, but we're feeling it out. He didn't seem to be the Gestalt language processor. She said, I think he does have some of that in him, because when she switched the way she was speaking to be more in Gestalts and chunks, she can see him going up in the capacities. She said he needs some support and structure to get into the higher capacities, but he'll go there if I start switching the way. And I'm still trying to figure out exactly what that means. So does that resonate with you? That's supporting his individual differences.
It does. And communication and language is such an individual difference. And you're saying that you thought he was an analytic processor. That's probably, but now she's finding that it's probably mixed, because people can be both. You can be both an analytic processor and a Gestalt language processor. And she's finding that these Gestalts, if she's possibly mitigating some of them and she's doing some things that that's resonating with him, and things are becoming more meaningful, then I think that's a beautiful way to go.
Right. And so, how do we support the ideation, so that the idea can come into the body and the body can express it with in the sequencing and in the grading of force and in the way it's in the timing and how it's getting executed, and then the feedback that gives to the body. So I just went through the process of motor planning. How do I support that in the interaction through relationship? And again, I'm going to go back to your gestural nonverbal system. And if you think about the vignette that Katie just described, and I have to say that I have the advantage of having seen the video that Katie described, but there was the way they were positioned next to one another to solve the problem. And the child that Katie described did have a dyspraxia profile. The way they were referencing one another, and the way that Katie used her gestures, her nonverbal system, her vocalizations, very little language, it gave the child feedback, and it scaffolded the child's interaction. So I think that, again, it goes back to that is such an important skill to hone for yourself as a player when you work on FEDC4. Because again, when you are giving that kind of feedback, or the leaning in, or the waiting, or the even just the breath is a gestural signal. So remember, you are signaling to the child in an interoceptive, affective way. You are embodying emotion when you use your nonverbal gestural system, with limited language, and that enables the child to truly feel the emotion and helps that transition from emotion into ideation, into symbol formation, which is what we want to get to 5. And so it is the feedback through in the circles, in the flow and the continuous flow. There is a continuous feedback. And how is the child getting the feedback? Think about it. The child is getting the feedback through the eyes, they see you, through the ears, they hear you, maybe through the feeling, because maybe you're moving. And that feedback is a multi-system feedback, right? That is then also paced. And so, you as the player on the floor, you are in the moment, but you are also in an analytical place. Like, okay, I can see, I need to support the sequencing. And so I just want to emphasize, think about how can you use your gestural system to support the scaffolding of getting the sequencing and the ideation.
A huge topic in the 4th capacity is limit setting. And so many parents come with questions about discipline and how do we set limits. I will link to the podcasts I have on a developmental approach to setting limits and setting limits depending on where your child is developmentally, where Dr. Gil Tippy and I went through, really depends where your child is developmentally, how you're going to set the limits. But let's talk about it in the context of the 4th capacity.
So, Katie, yesterday we had this great conversation about limit setting, and it started off by you sharing a little play vignette about a child taking risks and how that ended up being how the limit setting was imbued with engagement and humor. Do you mind to share that with us?
There was a little boy that really wanted to climb on top of the monkey bars, and he could go across the monkey bars, but he couldn't climb on top of the ladder. And we were using humor within the interaction to help him understand the limit and the boundary. So, and he completely understood he understood the tone of our voice when we were like, you can't go on top of the ladder, no climbing on the ladder. But then he would intentionally try to climb up and see what we would do. And he thought, but with our affective signals and all through the interaction and the humorous, we would stretch this interaction. We would stretch the back and forth about not climbing on top of the ladder, and he wouldn't. He just wanted to see our affect. He loved the affective exchanges that we were having, and he completely understood the limit just by stretching the interaction and not being punitive about it and saying absolutely not, you need to get down. You know, we use some humor, and I know you want to go on that ladder. And then when he'd go up there and would use a firmer voice, he'd immediately put his feet down, and he completely understood that he wasn't supposed to climb on top of this ladder, but he actually made it a game. So he was the one that made it a game because he loved our affect. So we gave him time and space, and we continued the interaction and tried to stretch it as much as we could, and have that continuous flow, and make meaning of what was happening for him. And so that the limit and the boundary was understood by him through our affective exchanges.
I hear so many elements of FEDC4 because it sounds like there was regulation. There was already regulation present, which is what we have in FEDC4. There is regulation. The regulation has a quality that is stable. So remember, you need stability to be flexible. So your regulation needs to be stable, that you can be more flexible in your ideation and in your engagement. And so there was a regulation so that the child could be flexible, and then you could have this engagement. You could actually have a reciprocal flow around the content of the no. And it's possible that your affect was arousing to him, so your affect supported what he needed in the way he processed and regulate. So it's possible that he needed a little more oomph, in your voice. He obviously sourced that. But I want to point out two aspects we have not gone into, but he was developing and fortifying his sense of self. That is what happens in 3 and 4, so when he was like going and you're saying no, that, and then he's doing something, that those circles were strengthening the sense of self. And then that becomes the foundation for him starting to realize, oh, but they have ideas. It's different than mine, because that's what limit setting is. Limit setting mean we have ideas that's different than the child, and the child has to have the capacity to receive or to hold the space. That one has ideas that's different than mine, but instead of it being a threat, it becomes a resource. And so it sounds like this child was working on that in a very playful, engaging, supportive, multi-system supportive way.
Yes.
So I hear everything you're saying, and I think I know the answer to this, but I know that a lot of times parents will say, okay, when I do that, like Katie said, it becomes a game, and then they're constantly trying to do bad, quote unquote, bad things just to get that reaction out of me. And I don't want them to do all these bad things. But you're saying that he created the game and that helped the regulation and everything. But like, what do you do when the child is just on purpose, say, dropping stuff from the top of the stairs to watch it fall that they shouldn't be dropping or whatever, and they're doing it because they know they're going to get that reaction out of you? Because that cause and effect is, we start with sensory play, then we go into object play where you have that cause and effect before you get into that symbolic play. And in the 4th capacity, you're sort of in between that cause and effect and starting to peek into the symbolic play. So, that's the first part. And the second part of that is a lot of parents find that once you get into that pattern, good luck stopping it. So now it becomes a pattern that my child's going to repeat every day because they love that when I do this, mom goes, hey, don't do that. And they love that reaction. And it's like, oh no, like, when are we going to get out of this pattern? Or I've given this example so many times to parent support group, how my son went through the phase of licking people. And then he went through the phase of smacking people, all innocently without ill intention, but just to get that cause and effect reaction. And then calling everybody uncle, which most kids didn't mind, but some of them, I'm not uncle, I'm so-and-so. And then it caused this big stir. And then starting to call people Mario names. And so whatever it is, he's instigating all these little like mischievous, silly things to get a kick out of somebody. And it might be okay when we're playing in fun, but in school it might be disruptive. Sanette?
You're looking at me. That's a tough one. Yeah, I mean, obviously we are exploring one aspect of limit setting, and I think there are different qualities and different needs of limit setting. There's definitely a place, when there's danger and there's risks where we do need to, be a parent who's able to contain the child with safe limits. And I think, and that is challenging. It's very challenging for children with neurodiversity. As we're doing this, as we're putting down our limits, whatever our capacity, the child's capacity, the situational capacity, we don't always have the time to do this kind of playfulness around the limit. But I think there should be some time of that, some time for that, because it helps the child explore the no. What does the no feel like? And I just want to say it's important that children experience emotions in their body in a shared environment. So that feeling of no puts the child in the more negative range, right? So remember, we talked about the emotional range. The middle is peaceful and content, the happy side, the elated, excited, curious, explorative side. But then we get the negative side when you're irritable and frustrated, and maybe you go into anger, and maybe even more than that. But that negative range is so hard. And the limit setting is putting the child in that place. And so you do need to have places where you are working with how are we together in the negative range? How are we together when we are irritated or frustrated or triggered or thin? What does togetherness look like? What does relationship look like? Because limit setting puts you there. But then also to understand, remember that DIR is a developmental model. And so the child's development of understanding your limit, the limit is a threat. It's a tidal wave for some children. It's a threat, right? And when you are threatened, you go in survival. You flip your lid, and there's a whole physiological reaction that goes with it. But the point is, there is a place for limit setting that needs to happen because of safety. But I think there is a backstory that we do need to work on. What does the shared world look like in a negative emotion, the back and forth? And can I play with the no, even in play? Yeah. Some thoughts.
Yeah, so Katie, what I hear her saying is, let's bring it into play. When we aren't in a rush. When we have the time, let's act all this stuff out in a playful setting so they get practice dealing with limits.
Yes, and connecting before redirecting as well. Like there's the connection before the correction. I think that's so important. And so having that connection and understanding of each other. So and just like you said, I mean, in play, being able to, just like we were talking about before in capacity 4, we explore such a broad range of emotions, and sometimes mischief and aggression and different things like that, those come up. And so the more comfortable we can feel with those emotions and playing within all of the emotions, not just being happy and sad and or excited and just all the positive emotions. Sometimes there are individuals that don't feel very comfortable exploring the other emotions, but the more comfortable we can get exploring those emotions in play, the better children will understand that broad range of emotions and the limits that we're setting. So yeah, that connection is so important.
So I know we have to wrap up. Are there any last tips you want to give to parents? How do we promote the 4th capacity besides strengthening the first 3 capacities, which is always the answer? Are there specific things you can think of? Like what kinds of tips do you give to strengthen that 4th capacity?
Well, I would just say make sure that you're able to create extra steps in your pretend play, to be animated and use your affect and through your facial expressions and your gestures and your vocalizations, and you're always deepening the plot. We want to make sure that we're not entertaining, but we're interacting. And that's also from the Child with Special Needs by Dr. Greenspan and Nader. And we just want to stretch those gestural exchanges.
Yeah, just to again say that remember that when you are working on problem solving, there's sequences involved. So you always want to think about how can you scaffold and support. And sometimes you have to look at the activity or the problem or the solution as an elephant, and you need to break down the parts, like what part can you do that enable the child to do the next? How can you support that sequencing? Again, using a variety of gestures, because that is a feedback system to the child, and pairing your gestures with your vocalization and your action, and even adding gestures or vocalizations to the child's action is a form of to strengthen the feedback loop. This whole idea that came out in the literature when we studied FEDC4 was this whole idea of counterbalancing. Right? So we want to counter-regulate. If they are agitated, we are soothing. If they're lethargic, we're more energizing. If they're impulsive, we are a little bit more containing, right? And maybe that's one of the things to unpack. And if they're fragmented, which often happen because the problem becomes a bit of a title, overwhelming. How can we be more organized? How can we scaffold and support their organization? And I think just last thing to say, that counter response, is actually a way to build their range of emotion.
Well, I know we could talk about this for the next week, but we'll leave it there for now. And if people have questions or ideas or anything else to point out, feel free to email me. But thank you so much, Katie Shepard. Thank you so much, Sanette Lorenz. And listeners, I hope you got a lot from this. I certainly did. It's a big topic. Thank you so much, ladies.
Thank you, Daria.
ICDL's new DIR parent network. Support, learn, and thrive together. There's so much value in our new DIR parent network. I cannot wait to interact with all of you and watch our support for each other grow. More information at icdl.com/parents or affectautism.com/events. Until next time, here's to choosing play and experiencing joy every day. Looking for a podcast on a specific topic or trying to find one you listened to before? Check the Start Here menu at affectautism.com, where you can search all podcasts and blog posts by topic, category, profession, or specific guest. You can also type in keywords into the search box, which is the magnifying glass icon at the top right of the website. Check it all out at affectautism.com.